Hello, story lovers. Welcome to another episode of Around the World in 40 Tales. My name is Doreen Vanderstoop, and I am here with the amazing Pearl Ann Gooding. Now, I have a few heroes in this organization of Storytelling Alberta, and Pearl Ann is definitely one of them. Welcome, Pearl Ann.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I am so excited that you're here with us tonight. Absolutely wonderful to have you. So today, Pearl Ann will share a story from right here in Alberta called Lil Oink. And as you can see, there's a little character right beside her. And Pearl Ann has painted that picture, especially for this live stream, which is just amazing and just shows the level of her many talents. So before we get into things, I just want to introduce Pearl Ann to everybody. So Pearl Ann is a longtime storyteller who loves the quick-paced interaction that a room full of children wrapped in a story can bring. As she puts it, the fun, the laughter, the sparkling eyes from a tale well told has a joy that can touch your soul. But the intimate telling of a tale that has several layers and meanings to an older audience is extremely fulfilling too. Pearl Ann's love of oral literature has taken her across Canada, performing in and attending concerts, festivals, museums, libraries, schools, conferences, and much more. Her favorite story topics include fairy tales, folk tales, interactive stories, humorous family tales, and tales with Canadian twists. So before we dive in, we just want to acknowledge that our episode tonight takes place on the traditional territories of the Indigenous signatories to treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10. We also walk in the footsteps of the Métis nations of Alberta and the Métis settlements. We make this declaration with respect and in the spirit of reconciliation. All right, Pearl Ann, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Little Oink wasn't just the dandiest little pig you ever did see. She was bright and lovable too. And there was nothing she loved more than to nestle into the crook of somebody's arms for a nice, long snug. Most often, those arms were my grandmother's. She'd rock and coo and lullaby that little pig into sweet slumber. At the time of Little Oink, my grandmother was just a young woman. She had 8 children of her own, but her youngest was already 4 years old. And how her arms ached for that sweet heaviness that only a newborn babe could provide. She'd rock and coo, and 2 crystal blue eyes would look lovingly up into hers. Little Oink came into the family quite by accident, as do most pet pigs, I would assume. Grandpa and Uncle Tommy, who was the 4-year-old at the time, had gone out to the old Colts farm to do some electrical work, Grandpa being the only electrician in the area. When Uncle Tommy discovered life writhing in the pig pen. The old sow had given birth to 13 piglets during the night. And what a sight it was to see all those little piglets writhing and squirming and trying to find their way onto the old sow. And they'd latch on, but only for a suck or two. And then they'd let go and work their way to the next stop to see if it tasted any better down there. You could not help but smile watching those animated antics until you saw the little one, the runt of the family. Try as she might to get onto the old sow, she couldn't. Every time she got close, one of the other piglets would push her out of the way or sit on top of her, and she couldn't latch on, not a single time. And it was without doubt that little pig would be dead within a day or two. It was a fact of life. It was a sad fact, but it was true. And sadder still was trying to explain that fact of life to a 4-year-old, which is how Grandpa ended up on the back porch, holding little Oink in his hands, waiting for his wife to come out. He had sent Uncle Tommy in to go get his mom, and he stood there holding that little pig He was looking past that pink, pudgy perfectness and looking at what the potential of that pig could be for his family. Pork chops, pork roast, cured bacon, and sugared ham. And oh, not only could he see in his mind's eyes months of Sunday dinners laid out in their full glory, he could smell them. Oh, lying on his bed Sunday morning and wafting into the room that sweet smell of sizzling sugared bacon, just coming in and out of his nose and calling him as if a siren of old, come, come into the kitchen. Or walking home after church and carried on the breeze that savory smell of roasted pork and rosemary. Mm. Oh, yes, he knew exactly what this pig could mean to his family. And he stood there with a twinkle in his eye and a smile from ear to ear, waiting with anticipation for his wife's response. And Grandma came out that squeaky screen door with Uncle Tommy in tow, burbling the whole adventure of what had gone on at the Colts farm. And she saw her husband standing there, chest puffed out, pleased as punch. And she looked down at that little form, no bigger than her two hands put together, those crystal blue eyes looking up at hers, that little nose bending and quivering and snorking out sweet sounds. And her first words, oh, does a little piggy need a new mama? And she reached out and she took that little pig and put it right in the crook of her arm, and that little pig nestled in as if she had done it 100 times before. And just as naturally, Grandma began to rock and sway and coo. The 6 girls in the house could hear that tone and tune of your mother and came running out to see who was there. And oh, they joined in that adoring circle of welcoming that little pig. They turned to go in the house, Grandma's skirt swishing as she pulled open that creaky screen door, and in they all went. All the sounds from the house were high and happy. But outside, Grandpa stood there alone on the back porch. That twinkle in his eye, dead. That smile on his face, decidedly downward, and his arms hanging useless at his sides. And he knew things would not be as they should. Cute? Without a doubt. Perfect to the bone as far as Grandma was concerned. But Grandpa, those eyes were not quite so endearing when he looked at that little pig. He looked past those crystal blue eyes and past that pudgy little nose and looked into what the whole essence of that pig's existence was meant to be. Dinner. It hardly seemed fair. Little Oink had already passed the chaos and ruckus of having 12 siblings who didn't care whether she lived or died, and bypassed Farmer Colt's hammer when he brought it out to end her life right then and there. And now there was Grandpa to deal with. But Grandma, oh, Grandma loved that little pig. She rocked it and swaddled it and fed it with a nipple on the end of a beer bottle. All the kids loved that little pig too. The girls would mother her and dress her up. Little Oink didn't know she was a pig. She only knew she was a member of the family. And the younger kids, well, they would play chase with little Oink all over the house. Their floors were all linoleum. So those little hooves would be clipping and clopping and slipping and sliding like she was running around in high heel shoes, especially when they went around the kitchen table and the coffee tables going around and around, and she'd be slipping and sliding and smashing into things. Even to watch her start running on those linoleum floors was hilarious. Those little legs would be going like lightning, but her body wasn't hardly moving at all. Little Oink was supposed to be sleeping in a box behind the wood burning stove. But every night she'd cry and whine until somebody would come and get her. They'd pick her up and they'd rock her, and she'd be sound asleep. And you'd put her in her box, but you wouldn't even make it out of the kitchen before she started crying and whining again. So more often than not, for those first few months, little Oink ended up sleeping under the covers in one of the kids' beds. Until finally, Grandpa put his foot down and said that a child's bed was no place for a pig, and it was forbidden for that pig to sleep in one of their beds again. It was a hard lesson for little Oink to learn. She didn't want to stay back behind that wood-burning stove, but being consistent and putting her back time and time again, she did get used to the idea, and soon thereafter discovered the larder, which didn't seem to be that bad of a trade-off for the little pig. Also nestled behind the wood-burning stove were bottles of homemade root beer. They're laying at rest, waiting for the yeast and the sugar to carbonate and get its flavor all the way through. One night, one of the bottles began to ferment, and a lid popped off. A lid blew off, and foam root beer was shooting out like a geyser, scaring the bejeebers out of little Oink. Little Oink started to scream and squeal and get up and run, and then another bottle, pop, smash, blue, blast. It was popping and snapping and blasting and crashing, and little Oink was running all over the house, screeching and screaming and banging into the bedroom doors, and there was furniture getting knocked over, and ornaments were smashing all over the floor. The whole family had got up, and everyone was running around after the pig, trying to catch her. It was as if the front lines of World War II had moved into their house. And finally, when they were able to calm the pig down, the house was nothing less than a disaster. And even Grandma, little Oink's biggest advocate, had to admit, little Oink was not that little anymore. And their house was not big enough to house a full-grown pig. It was decided that the next day little Oink would move down to the barnyard. And so the next morning, Grandma and all 8 kids and little Oink went single file down to the barnyard as if they were walking the last mile. And when they got down there, they said their farewells and put little Oink over the fence, and then they turned to head back up to the house. They hadn't gotten very far before little Oink weed, reminding them that they had forgotten her. But Grandma had told them they were not to turn around or stop, just keep on walking. And little Oink's calls got louder and louder and more frantic, accompanied by banging and scraping and digging. And they were about halfway back to the house when this little cloud of dust went whizzing by. And when they got up to the house, there on the back porch was little Oink. Her tail was just a wagging like the dickens. Her tail was the most precious thing. If she were pleased and content, it would be coiled right up into a little tight spring. And if she were sad or not feeling well, that little tail would just droop straight down to the ground. But if she was happy and excited, that tail would wag back and forth and round, and that's exactly what that tail was doing then. Uncle Ronnie and the older girls were sent back down to the barnyard to secure the fence. And that little pig was quite resourceful. It took several reinforcements to keep her in there. But after a few days, little Oink, much like sleeping behind the wood-burning stove, got used to the idea. And she stayed. She looked forward each day for when the kids would come down and visit with her. And the summer days started to blend one into the other, and fall entered in much the same. Until about Thanksgiving time, Grandpa came down to take a look at little Oink. And he looked over that fence, and that glisten was back in his eyes, and that smile was back across his face, and it sent a shiver of fear up little Oink. It was as if ice were running through her veins. And Grandpa leaned over the fence so he could pet little Oink, but she moved out of the way. So Grandpa hopped over top of the fence, and little Oink took off to the other end. And then Grandpa started giving chase. He went running after that pig, and that pig was running for all that she was worth. And then finally, Grandpa jumped and leapt, and he grabbed her right around the middle. And little Oink started squealing like she was an ungreased wheel, squealing and screaming and wee. And Grandpa was hanging on. Little Oink even got down and was rolling around and trying to get on top of him, anything to get rid of him. But Grandpa's grip was like iron. But that sweat made him a little bit slippery and down through her body until he just had hold of her leg, and he was hanging on, but she was kicking her leg and stomping and doing everything she could. And Grandpa just about lost grip when he got a hold of her tail. He's hanging on to her tail, and he dug both his feet in like he was anchored in. And he was holding on for all that he was worth. And little Oink was pulling for all that she was worth. She would pull, and Grandpa would pull. And she'd pull harder, and Grandpa would pull harder. And it seemed as if they were locked into a stalemate, neither one of them giving an inch, when all of a sudden little Oink shot right onto the other side of the barnyard. And Grandpa was shocked beyond belief. He is covered in dust and dirt and streaked with sweat all the way down to his hands, but still in his hands was little Oink's tail. And if her tail would have been stronger, then my tail would have been longer.
Thank you, Pearl. That story is amazing. I love the ebb and flow of the tension that you create in that story. It's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It was a fun story to grow up with all my aunts and uncles and telling their favorite parts of little Oink and all the fun things that she did in their house.
That's wonderful. So if whoever wants to reach out to Pearl Ann, they can contact Storytelling Alberta at info@storytellingalberta.com. And if you want to see other stories in this series and also in our Tribute Tales series, all for our 40th anniversary, then please go to our website at storytellingalberta.com, and you'll find all of our wonderful offerings there. So special thanks again to Pearl Ann, and thank you to all our generous listeners for joining us today. We will be back again next Thursday with another tale to tell.